If you have ever wanted to make stop motion, you probably know how frustrating it can be to find out that all the gear you need can cost hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. When I was starting out, I felt the same way. In fact, the first camera that I used was my laptop's built-in camera. It looked terrible, but it taught me an important lesson. You don't need expensive gear to make stop motion. Or do you? Right here, I have my cheap smartphone, and right here, I have my professional $1,000 plus stop motion setup. I'm gonna try to make the same stop motion with both setups and see which one turns out better. Now, smartphones can be ridiculously expensive. I mean, look at the new iPhone 14 Pro Max. It costs over $1,000, which is absolutely insane. I would hardly consider that to be a budget phone. However, if you are like me, you have a fairly inexpensive phone. I have a Motorola from 2020 that costs around $150, and it works fine for what a phone is supposed to do. Now, the camera's not great, but it works for stop motion. Okay, so the first thing I needed to do was to come up with a plan for the stop motion. Since I was limited to what I could shoot with a smartphone, I had to come up with a simple idea that still looked interesting. Now, I could have made a Lego stop motion, but those tend to take a long time to make, so I decided to make a Matchbox car animation instead. This would allow me to repeat a similar movement on both cameras, since a car doesn't have as many joints as a minifigure does. I set up my smartphone and used 2 books to prop it up. This method is not very sturdy, but it gets the job done. At first, I had both books behind the phone, but then I realized that I kept knocking the phone over, so I wedged the phone between both books, and it worked much better. For lighting, all I used was a desk lamp that most of you probably have at home. Now, to bring this whole setup together, I used Stop Motion Studio, which is a free app for iOS and Android devices. This app is fantastic, but one of the issues I had was that every time I went to press the shutter button, the phone would shake or fall over. To fix this, I tried using the timer feature, but when I did that, onion skinning wouldn't work. This meant I had to use the regular shutter button, which also meant it was very hard to keep the phone upright. Now, another issue I ran into was that the light seemed to flicker just a little bit. I noticed this in the time lapse that I was taking for the behind the scenes, but this didn't seem to show up in the animation at all. I tried to make the zero budget stop motion look as good as possible, but it was very difficult due to the fact that the phone kept falling over and that the light wasn't a very good light. Fortunately, I finished the zero budget stop motion, but I still had to film the same scene all over again with over $1,000 worth of equipment. With this setup, I had a lot more options. I used my Canon SL2, a $500 camera with a $200 tripod. The SL2 was connected to my PC, which was over $1,000 alone. I used a $200 professional light and an RGB bulb with a desk lamp. Even though I could have used my 2 other lights, I chose not to because they weren't really necessary for the style I wanted to get. This setup made life a whole lot easier because I was finally able to use manual features instead of having to rely on the phone to get a good image. Also, the professional tripod made pans and tilts a lot smoother. However, one downside to this setup, besides the cost, was that all this gear meant that there were so many different moving parts to think about. Also, I realized that sometimes having a simpler setup means you can focus more on animation rather than worrying about all the technical details. I think there is just something about using a budget setup that makes it feel a lot more relaxed. With professional gear, it often feels more formal and intimidating to use. Now, this isn't necessarily a drawback to using pro gear, but it is definitely something you will want to consider if you are a beginner. Sometimes it is just better to focus on the skills rather than focusing on the gear. Oh, and if you were wondering, here's how both turned out. I didn't have a ton of time to make them look perfect, but I think they both turned out pretty good for the amount of time that I did have. Of course, I could have been a lot more careful with the smartphone to avoid shaking, and I could have refocused it more so it wasn't as blurry. The $1,000 setup looks cleaner and more professional, but if you are someone who doesn't have a ton of money, I would recommend just starting out with whatever you have and then just practicing your skills. If you do want to improve your skills, I happen to have a lot of stop motion tutorials. I would recommend watching this one first so you can start in making the best stop motions possible. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.